All right, everyone, let's get this started. My name is Mallory Wilsey. I'm the Director of Marketing at mStoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that deliver real results. I'm excited to welcome you to today's session on myth-busting enrollment marketing. Michael Stoner is the co-founder and the president of mStoner. He's served hundreds of education institutions, nonprofits, and businesses on 4 continents. He's spoken at numerous conferences, written about online and offline marketing for higher ed, and has blogged at mstoner.com since 2003. He also co-edits the Call to Action blog about higher ed marketing, branding, and communications on Inside Higher Ed. Gil Rogers is the Director of Marketing at NRCCUA, a recognized leader in enrollment management and marketing for higher ed. Gil has spoken at numerous regional, national, and international conferences on the topics of student recruitment and engagement at each phase of the college admissions and marketing process. Gil served in leadership positions in enrollment marketing at the University of New Haven and the University of Hartford in Connecticut prior to joining NRCCUA. Michael and Gil, I'll turn this session over to you. Let's learn about myths versus realities in higher ed.
Thank you, Mallory, and thanks for setting us off in such a great way. Hello, everybody, and if you've joined us for one of these sessions before, you have a sense about the format that we're going to use. We're reporting on a survey that we did earlier this year with prospective students, teens specifically, and professionals like you. And what we did is we fielded a questionnaire to teens with a very similar questionnaire containing the same questions to the professionals. And our objective in this research is to get a sense of where there are gaps in understanding and where there's a real knowledge among us about what teens like and what they don't like in terms of the whole enrollment marketing spectrum. And as in previous webinars like this, we're setting it up in, we're talking about myths and realities. So we've kind of teased out some statements that we'd like to ask you about, whether you believe it's a myth or a reality, about what teens think. And then we'll go through some takeaways from our research, and we'll have time for discussion and questions at the end, as Mallory said. So myth or reality, we're just going to go through these really quickly now, but you can be thinking about whether you believe these are myths, these statements reflect myths or realities. Most teens review dozens of websites during college search and choice. Print is dead to teens. Teens prefer online interactions to face-to-face interactions. Online ads are effective at reaching teens. Are they or aren't they? Is that a myth or a reality? How about this one? Retargeting is creepy and turns teens off. A bad visit to campus means that you're off their list. Rankings matter to teens. And students don't want colleges to text them. That's one in particular that's controversial these days, I believe. So let's talk very briefly about demographics for the samples for our survey. As far as people with the professional side of things are concerned, the professionals that we surveyed work across multiple functions on campus. About half, 49%, work in marketing, 30% in web and related, web communications, digital communications. 25% worked in admission, and 43% worked in publics, 33% worked in private universities, and 16% in liberal arts colleges. And more than 50% have worked in higher ed for 5 to 15 years. So there's a depth of experience there. And Gil, tell us about the students that we heard from.
Will do. And Michael, thank you so much for having us today, for hosting this webinar today. And Mallory, thank you for the great introduction. So a quick overview of the demographics of our teen respondents. We received responses from about 1,700 prospective students. And as Michael mentioned earlier, we focused this study on prospective teens. So what an institution would consider a traditional student, a high school senior or junior, who they're actively trying to recruit right now. One interesting data point that we really wanted to point out is that about 66% of students who responded to this survey used a smartphone to respond. And that's compared to 96% of professionals who are using a laptop or a large screen computer to respond. So there's something to be said here about the mobile native presence that students have, or the mobile native aspect of the process. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means with some of these myths and realities as we go on. The makeup of the population of students, about half were juniors in high school, about a third were sophomores in high school, and the rest were balances of other class. About 2% were high school seniors. So majority of the students that we looked at were students who were juniors at the time, who will be the seniors you'll be trying to recruit for next year's class. About half of these students were actively researching colleges, with about a third of or about 40% of the students rather, at the phase of deciding where to apply. So a pretty representative sample of students at the appropriate phases of the process to be where we as enrollment marketers are trying to reach them and influence their decisions at that discovery and list building phase of the recruitment process.
I think it's important to add too to what Gil said, is that we also asked them to give us feedback about how effective some of the tactics we were using are at reaching them at various points along the application spectrum. So we have some interesting feedback about that, as you'll see as we get into some of our results. So let's go to our first myth or reality. And here's an opportunity for you to share your feedback. Do you think this is a myth or a reality that teens view dozens of websites during their college search and choice process? And we'll wait to get some answers here. But one of the things that we found when we presented this at the AMA Symposium for the Marketing of Higher Ed is that a lot of people in the audience did believe that teens looked at a broad range of websites and lots of them. So we'll see how you feel about that. Look at that, 59% believe it's a reality. Well, that's interesting. So let's close that out and see what students told us. And what we heard from our colleagues. 66% of professionals believe teens review 11 or more higher ed websites during college search or choice. So a solid 2/3 of our colleagues said that they did. And how about the teens? What did they tell us?
Yeah, so this is an interesting area of some misalignment. Only 23% of teens said that they explored 11 to 20.edu sites. So we gave different ranges, and that was the range from 11 to the top. Interestingly, 55% of teens explored 10 or fewer .edu sites. So what this says to me, and Michael, I'd love your take, is that students are more focused than we give them credit for sometimes. They are researching institutions across a variety of channels. Maybe they're using, college help sites and review sites at the beginning of their process. Potentially they are, leveraging their high school guidance counselor to help build their list before going onto websites. They go to the sites when they're looking for official information. I think we learned that last year in the Mythbusting web study, that students go to a .edu to gather, to get the step-by-step process and admissions requirements. They're not necessarily going to go through that work until they've already narrowed down their list. So it's interesting to think about that. Students are just a little more focused than you give them credit for.
Right, exactly. They've got a lot of ways to sort of build their initial list, and they're not doing it by visiting multiple college websites and looking at them in depth until they've constructed a list in other ways. So let's go on to the next myth, and here's one that I think is really interesting. Print is dead to teens. You know, we think about this group as the online generation. Gil already shared about how many of the responses came in from teens using smartphones. And I have to admit, Gil, that I was stunned when I saw that number. I thought it would be high, but I didn't think it would be that high. And I don't know what your take on that was, but it was really surprising to me. So here is the mobile generation. 90% of you believe that print is dead to teens is a myth. Well, interesting. So let's see what the professionals that we surveyed told us. And in fact, only 20% believe that print influenced teens' opinions of a college. And I included this slide because I know this next slide because I know that Gil really loved it. We did a presentation a couple years ago on myth-busting admissions, where we looked at did a similar survey around admission, and these were some of the reactions on Instagram to teens who got college mail and were sharing the excessive number of print publications that they received. And this was well received when we showed it at conferences. So let's look at what teens told us.
So I think that slide worked in a lot of ways because everybody's kind of on that boat of, you know, only 20%
Right.
thinking it's influential. Right. So maybe we're doing less of it. Who knows? So when we looked at the top influencers of teens' opinions of a college, so positive or negative, what influences your opinion of a college? 62% said the website. 30% said print of all teens. So it's higher than we as professionals are giving it credit for by about 10 points. But it's still, you know, not the huge, you know, needle mover that we thought it was a few years ago, and now we're thinking less of. That's not to say print is dead, but it's also not to say that print should be the only arrow in your quiver, which I think many of us get and understand. There's an opportunity here to leverage and utilize the resource, but not as the only resource, and be smarter about how we're using our lists. You know, when we looked at a slice of the data by first generation students, about 35% of students said that print had that influenced their opinion of a college. So being smarter, and this is something I think institutions are getting better and better at, is getting smarter about how we are using our data to identify our targeted lists, which means maybe we're not sending as much junk mail because we're sending more influential mail. So, you know, print is definitely part of the portfolio, just like email, but it's not the only arrow in your quiver. And when you are using print, because it's expensive, it's important to be targeted with your approach and really be better about how we identify the students we're trying to reach, whether it be predictive models, you know, working with your team to identify target markets, and being better about how we identify those students.
One thing I want to say about this slide is that only 22% said official social media is influential to them. And I think it's important to point out here, it's not that they don't pay attention to official social media, but it seems as if they form their opinions before they actually use about a college that they're considering. They form those opinions before they actually spend a lot of time on official social media. So that's part of their decision making, but it's not part of the initial process of forming an opinion about whether this institution would be a good one for them or not. It comes a little bit later in the process.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. I think that was something I've spoke about a few times over the past couple of years is, you know, college search and help review sites, digital tools, search engines, those sorts of things are the discovery engines, right? That's the top of the funnel, you know, the beginning of the discovery process. Social media is definitely more of a decision driver for a lot of students. It's, you know, it's great to have visibility on social. It's great to be responsive on social. You know, digital media and marketing and advertising, those sorts of things can be done at various phases of the process. But really, you know, where a student's going to try to find you and engage with your content, or students at your institution, social is going to be more at that bottom of the funnel of the process, because that's where they're figuring out fit at that point.
Right. And one of the things that we learned last year in the Mythbusting website research that we did is that teens say by a large majority that they don't click through from a college website to a social channel, and they don't click through from a social channel to a college website. So they have other ways of getting to those official social media accounts when they decide to interact with them. All right, well, let's move on to the next myth. And here's an interesting one. Again, we're talking about the mobile, the online generation. Teens prefer online interactions to face-to-face interactions. So what do you think about that? Is that true, or is it a myth? Myth or reality? That's a particularly interesting one for any of us who see teenagers, say, in their kitchens on a Saturday morning, as happens at my house, looking at their phones and, doing this with each other, which is pretty common behavior. Oh, look at that. 59% believe it's a myth, and 44% believe it's a reality. So let's see what professionals said. And before we actually share a fairly complicated slide with some of the results, I think I don't like to do that in these presentations because I know they're hard to read, but I think it's interesting. Let me just say that in general, professionals underestimate the interest teens have in communicating by email and overestimate their interest in social media. So when it comes to particular online channels, that's one thing that where there's a sort of a misalignment in understanding. So here's what professionals assume are the communications professionals of teens. And you can see, phone, which is a sort of a proxy for face-to-face as well as in-person communications, rank below social, or rank below in when teens are interacting in. We believe when teens are researching colleges and are more important to teens when they've accepted admission and are deciding. So let's see what teens actually said about that.
And pay attention to the shifts as the slide transitions here, because there's some interesting scenarios here. So obviously look at phone. There's an interesting component here where, phone is higher than we give it credit for. And I agree with Michael that phone is kind of a proxy for another way to connect face to face. We're talking to each other, right? Whether it's me in the same room or being able to pick up the phone and talk to someone. The email is not dead to teens either. We didn't do an email is dead to teens myth, but there's every year there's a new article on Huffington Post or whatnot, and I know there was a keynote speaker at AMA questioning the validity of email. But email is used by students at various phases for different things. A lot of ways, and we find this in other research studies like eXpectations and others, that email is a virtual filing cabinet for students in a lot of ways. So while they're researching schools and they're accepted and deciding where to apply, they are going back to that to find specific information on your website, important information that you've sent them. So when we're building email communications, it's important to think about clear call to action, one ask within the note, keep it important, make the emails important. I think we send a lot of fluff marketing emails, which is what really impacts our read rates and response rates from students. So really looking at your communication plan when it comes to what's impactful to students. And the other area to think about too is the direct mail component. Direct mail, when well matched with a good message that resonates well and is tied in with all of your other communications, is definitely important. Not as important during the research phase as the accepted phase, but it's still up there as far as overall communications. And if we go to the next slide too, one area we wanted to focus on was the influence that these channels have on a student's opinion, on various channels that students have on student opinions. When we look at these, it's important to think about the personal interaction channels. Again, we have campus visit and a tour. Students are interacting with their tour guide. They're interacting with an admissions officer, other students, other admitted students, or other prospective students. Things like a school visit, that would be a college rep coming to their high school to visit, at their high school. Again, a person coming to visit, and then phone call, again, being up there. So there's definitely an opportunity the admissions business is still a people business in every sense of the word. Somebody should tweet that, because that came out really well. I'm going to use that in another presentation at some point. But it's definitely still a people business, and we don't want to devalue the value of a face-to-face interaction. It's just there are so many other channels now that are also part of this process. So it's not an either or with a lot of this stuff. It's more of an and when it comes to reaching students.
Right. And I'd say probably one of the things that surprised me the most in these responses, Gil, and I just wanted, as a former admission officer who had to do this, I was just curious about your reaction to the importance of the school visit, and how students rate that, more highly than a phone call, than official social, than a print brochure. That opportunity to have that personal one-on-one connection is so important these days.
Yeah. And I think that to speak to that, I think that the challenge with high school visits is, in a lot of ways, it's a missed opportunity. So many counselors go, they put in a lot of work to build out their schedule, go to visit these schools, and then either they get there and there's no students to meet with, which is unfortunate, happens sometimes, but it's unfortunate. The guidance counselor is super busy and doesn't have time to talk to them. And then when they do have a student or a group of students, many times we do a sales pitch, right? We do hey, let me tell you about the institution. I think there would be a lot more value to these school visits if we spent the time to support students through this process. Instead of coming and just doing a sales pitch about your institution, come and talk about the process, the application process in general, provide, tips for essays, help, financial aid workshops. Those sorts of things really add a lot of value to the dialogue, and, hopefully would energize the admissions officer a little bit more, so that you're seeing the value and you're getting that good feeling too. Because the students are going to remember the person that helped them more than they remember the person that tried to sell them on attending the institution. Another tweetable moment. So make the most of that. Make the most of that opportunity.
Well, I think also it points to the importance of thinking about reaching out to people personally, in letters, in emails, in whatever way you do. The more personal you can be, the more effective you're going to be, the more effective that outreach is going to be.
Yep, more personal and more strategic.
Right.
Don't build your prospect pool with a bunch of students who don't want to hear from you and aren't going to be a good fit. Focus on the best fit for your school, and those are the students who will like every form of communication you try to use to reach them.
Right. In the white paper, we'll say more about some of the ways they want to be contacted during the process. We don't really have time to do that during this presentation, but there's some really interesting feedback there. So let's move on to the next myth or reality, and this is about advertising. So online ads are effective at reaching teens. Is this a myth or a reality? I was thinking about this the other night last night because I was traveling and I was reading a lot of news and kept seeing all these online ads on sites that I don't visit all that much. So it was an interesting experience to be on the receiving end of some of this stuff. And I know what my reaction is. Myth: online ads are effective at reaching teens, 57%, reality, 45%. So here's what professionals said about rating the effectiveness of online ads. And professionals believe that about 45% of professionals believe that online ads are effective at building brand awareness among teens. That 36%, about a third, said they're effective at generating information requests. And about 30% said, we can get some campus visits through online ads and some application submissions and yield. So I'd say in general, professionals don't find these online ads to be particularly effective at getting a measurable result. So one of the questions that I have about brand awareness is how do you tell that brand awareness has been increased from an online ad? It's a little bit hard to do. But you can certainly measure the information requests. You can certainly measure requests for campus visits and application submissions and yield. So there's a way that you can actually tell if your ads are working. So let's take a look at what teens said.
Yeah, and I think all those data points plus this data point to the fact, how many times can I say point, that there's a huge need to focus on strategic use of digital marketing and effective tracking of digital marketing, because 67% of teens recall seeing ads from a college, particularly on their computer and also on their mobile device. And we have a little bit on mobile. It'll be bigger in the white paper. But what's interesting is that 36% of the teens who remembered seeing an ad say that they had clicked it on their computer or their mobile device. So, so 67% of students said that they saw it, and a third of students said that they actually clicked, which is a great recall rate and click-through rate with respect to overall digital marketing. It speaks to the need for better tracking and being more strategic about your use of digital marketing. I think, to Michael's point, you can't really measure brand awareness. Your closest proxy for that is number of inquiries generated, right? But goals before tools. What is the goal of using the specific digital marketing tactic? Are you advertising on Facebook just because you feel like everyone else is advertising on Facebook? Be more strategic about that, the use of those channels. We also asked about other advertising channels, and it's interesting when we think about, there are still plenty of ways to reach students. Television advertising. 55% of students said that they'd heard of a college on television. In many ways, a lot of these, and Michael and I have talked about this, are going to be schools that advertise during football games on weekends.
Yeah.
Not every school is going to have the budget to do TV advertising, but many would have potentially YouTube advertising, radio advertising budgets. But the challenge with respect to a lot of these are that the influence that they have on recall and post view engagement. We did a little bit digging into how students act, what behavior students had after viewing a lot of these different channels, and it really doesn't move the needle in remembering a school or going back to that school's website. Specifically with we didn't even put them on here, things like outdoor advertising, bus wrappers, billboards, those sorts of things might be great for community engagement, faculty engagement. The president wants to see a billboard off the highway. But if your goal is to recruit new students with outdoor advertising, it's really not something that students engage with. And we'll have more in the white paper to bring that out, but that gives you an idea of the specific channels that students are using. It's not outdoor for sure.
What I think is interesting about this slide is the 24%, nearly a quarter of respondents who said that they haven't seen an ad for a college in any of these channels, or online or on their mobile phone. So if that I find really, really fascinating, and it's a testimony to the opportunity that's out there for institutions that want to be smart about this. There are opportunities to do effective advertising without spending a lot of money on it, and without getting into a bowl. without your football team getting into the bowl or winning a basketball championship. So let's move on to another myth or reality about retargeting. And retargeting is retargeting is creepy and turns teens off. And retargeting is the familiar practice that all of us are familiar with. You know, you look at socks on Amazon.com, and all of a sudden, every website you visit has an ad for those exact same socks that you looked at on Amazon.com, just following you around wherever you go. And you know what? It shows up in your Facebook feed too. So that's what retargeting is. And 81% say it's a myth, that it's creepy and turn teens off, and 22% says it's a reality. So professionals in our survey, 90% of them said that they believe teens react somewhat positively, or very positively to retargeting. And 22% of professionals think teens have a neutral reaction.
Yeah, so to revisit those professional points real quick, we as professionals believe that it's not creepy. I think that everybody, or at least it is creepy, but it works, right? I think is the better way to look at it. So many.
Let's reframe that, Gil. Let's say that we believe that teens don't think it's creepy. We might think it's creepy ourselves.
Correct. So, and we get creeped out or annoyed or frustrated, but we still do it because we believe that it works, right? So, interestingly, about half of students had noticed ads for a school, for a college online or on a social site after they visited that college's website. So we didn't ask students, have you been retargeted by a school, because they wouldn't really know what that means. But when we told them what the process, half of them said that it happened. 57% of the students who were aware that of the retargeting advertising they were receiving said it had no effect on their perception of the college. So that was that neutral reaction, which is good, because one of the biggest concerns that kind of was around a couple of years ago, that is obviously not as big of a deal now, was, well, when students see that we're advertising, it's going to negatively impact the perception of our brand. I think that's kind of gone away, or is going away. And then, you know, when we looked at the data even further, about a third of the students who were aware of the retargeting, they said that affect their view positively, somewhat positively, or very positively. So not as high as what our professional responses would say, but still not something to not do it with respect to our overall, you know, outreach. Because when you do the math, basically all students are either neutral or positive when it comes to their reaction to being retargeted. Because if you think about it, going back to earlier in the presentation, students aren't visiting dozens of college websites when doing their research. And then of the sites they are visiting, not all of them are doing retargeting, because based on the research, there's still a healthy number of schools that aren't doing it. They're not being over bombarded by most retargeting advertising. Now with that said, there's some caveats with retargeting. Retargeting is one of those strategies that can balloon your budget pretty quickly if you don't control it, right? You know, frequency capping, day parting, you know, post-click engagement, you know, looking at conversion pixels. I mean, I'm throwing a lot of jargon out there that, you know, we could totally set up a whole separate webinar and call on. In fact, we have, and I'm happy to send you the recording. When you're doing this type of marketing, just because it doesn't creep out students and it tends to have a positive and or neutral reaction, means you should really be strategic with it, because you don't want to poison the well when it comes to that type of an outreach.
Yeah, exactly. I think we'll to me, it's like the question about texting, which we'll talk about shortly. And I don't want to give too much away, but you don't want to we don't want people doing so much retargeting that it does become creepy and it does turn teens off, because you know, certainly I'm at the point now where I'm one of those people who thinks that retargeting is creepy, and it really turns me off. And I wonder if I should be doing things like do not track and using those websites all the time that hide my identity from websites so that I'm not retargeted in everything that I do. So this is really a key point. A bad visit to campus means you're off their list. Is that a myth or reality? You know, we believe, and I certainly have believed this for a long time, that if you can get students to campus, you know, one of the purposes of your website is to get students to visit campus, because that's really where the sell is made, and that's where they're going to develop this emotional connection to an institution, and it is that emotional connection that really helps make the sell, that helps to convince them that this is the place that is right for them. So what happens if there's a bad visit? Does it really turn them off? And it looks as if 81% of our audience believes that's a reality. And that a large majority of our professional respondents, in fact, 94% said that a bad visit negatively impacts a teen's perception of a college's and that he or she is interested in.
Yeah.
And here's what teens told us.
Interestingly, 65% of teens said that a bad visit will negatively impact their view of a college that they are really interested in. So if they're really interested in you, one bad visit, you know, one rainy tour isn't going to turn them off from your school. Now, with that said, as a former admissions officer supervising the team that oversaw the campus visits and oversaw the campus tours, I want us to think I want 94% of us to think that students are a bad visit would make a student not want to attend the institution, because you want those visits to be great. So this isn't a permission slip to not have good campus visits just because the student response is lower than the professional response, because the reality here is that still 2/3 of students saying that a bad visit will negatively impact their view of the college. So it's not as high as professionals would believe, but that's because, you know, we're putting the pressure on ourselves to put together a perfect visit. But that means that if it rains on open house, it doesn't mean that every kid that came to open house is not going to apply. You still have a chance to get those students if they're in fact really interested in enrolling at the school.
Yeah, and it strikes me that this is one case where having a personal relationship and having personal interactions can really help to dispel some of the concern some of the concerns or the opinions, negative opinions that might arise from that bad visit. Let's move on to the next myth or reality, and this is that rankings matter to teens. So what do you think? Do you think teens pay attention to rankings and that they really matter? Or is that just something that we're absorbed with and we believe that teens are following, but they don't pay much attention to? So I'll be really curious to hear what this audience thinks. 49% said it's a myth and 54% said it's a reality. And in our survey, 80% of professionals believe teens use U.S. News and World Report rankings. And so here's some of the responses that we got from teens.
Yeah, and one quick note of context: we're not here to pick on U.S. News. One of the things to make sure we point out. Yeah, one thing that we want to point out is that we polled when we asked students, we gave them a comprehensive list of what I would consider to be the mainstream rankings. Right. So U.S. News is one of them, obviously. Princeton Review, Forbes, Niche, all have different rankings and they use rankings in different ways. Interestingly, about 7 out of 10 students, when given that list of options, either said they didn't use rankings or they didn't select one of the rankings we gave. So there's definitely a disconnect there where 80% of us believe that students are using them, but 7 out of 10 are not, or 80% of us believe they're using U.S. News. 7 out of 10 aren't using any or aren't using the ones we would consider to be mainstream. So there's an interesting little caveat there. We do focus on U.S. News though, because out of the ones students did select, it is by far the most well-known. So of the students who did use US News, 4 out of 10 of those students are legacy. And I see a question from David popped up. I'll answer it before even the end of the presentation. Legacy is, we would define as not first generation students. So any student whose parents had attended college. So out of the students who do, 4 out of 10 are legacy. That means 6 out of 10 are not legacy, right? So of the first gen students who used US News, 68% of those students said that they find it useful. This provides a very interesting opportunity to think about how we're advising students, how we're supporting students through the process, because then we get into a whole separate webinar, we get into the philosophical conversation about should the rankings be, useful to a population of students that may need some additional support or guidance, et cetera. That's a whole separate conversation to have, but it's just an interesting perspective here that we professionals in the field believe that students are using the rankings, but the reality is they're not as widely as we would believe. Parents are probably, for sure. They're alumni care about it, the president cares about it, but prospective students are not necessarily as focused on it when they're researching schools.
So what do you think? Students don't want colleges to text them. Do you think that's true or false, a myth or a reality? 76% think it's a myth and 28% think it's a reality. Let's see what we heard from our respondents. 66% of professionals said that having a college text a teen would positively impact his or her view of a college. So 66% of professionals believe that a teen would have a positive impression if they were texted by a college. And 43% said that their college texts prospective students. So interestingly enough, that's nearly half of our respondents said that their colleges actually do text teens. But we heard something very interesting from the teens that we surveyed.
Yeah, and this is in line with other research on the topic. 82% of teens said that they have never received a text message from a college. And 56% of teens said that receiving a text message from a college would positively impact their view of the college. So there's definitely an opportunity here for engaging our prospective students, but this is just like retargeting. This is another one of those situations where we don't want to poison the water in the well with respect to a channel. If we treat text messaging like a old school traditional search campaign, where you just go buy a big bucket of names and you send them all a bunch of letters, students are going to be turned off by that process. And it's more so about providing them with contextual cues of what is important at that time. So things like application deadline reminders, particularly for students who have started an application but maybe not have submitted that application, upcoming events and event reminders or confirmations. If I go onto a school's website and I register for an open house, and if I say I agree to get text message updates, I should get a text message reminder a day or two before the open house, reminding me about check-in time and what parking lot to go to, those sorts of things. So it's not fluff text messages like, hey, click here to discover XYZ college. It's more so the student is already interested in XYZ college, already done something to engage with XYZ college. Now we're going to provide them with cues to help them not screw up the process, right? Keep them up to date and to informed, give them something to do, some sort of action-oriented message is what students are really looking for.
And let's add one important caveat to that too, Gil, and that is if you're an admission officer and you have a relationship with a teen and that teen has indicated that they're open to texting with you, then by all means go ahead and text them, because you've got permission to use that medium as a form of communication, an interpersonal communication. But don't assume that if they haven't given you permission that they want texts from you, because they may well not. And let's we're close to the time when we want to wrap up our presentation and take your questions. Let's just close by sharing some key considerations for marketing to teens.
Yeah.
And this, these are some things that we've sort of pulled out of the responses from both the professionals and from the teens that we believe are really important to underscore as we close out the myths and realities portion of our presentation.
Yeah, and I think the first point there, and I mentioned this before with multiple channels, leveraging traditional versus digital outreach based on the responses from students and from professionals, like Michael mentioned. It's not an either or, it's an and. I think Stephanie Geyer from Ruffalo and Levitz a few weeks ago was presenting with her at a conference, and she had a really good quip where she said that one of the reasons why we don't do some of these things is we say, oh, we don't have enough room on our plate to do these things. And I think we have to come to the realization that we have to eat. No one's going to take something off of our plate. It's about making these things fit on our plate in appropriate ways. If it's about having enough room on your plate, change the portion sizes of things, right? So I think, and I added that little note to it, by the way, that was mine. But so it's, scale back on things that aren't working as well and do things that are working better. Don't say, oh, we can't do text messaging because we don't have enough room on our plate. There's an opportunity to leverage text messaging in your digital marketing. Buy smarter lists of prospects, send less mailers to a smarter list, and use that leftover budget to do a text messaging program. There's opportunities to make all these things work together.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the add-ons to that is that it's okay to have high expectations, but that you have to temper those with a sense of what is influential with those expectations. So, the old school blasting out form letters and random postcards, that's not something that is going to work anymore. Personal communications are really where it's at. So some of those channels can be very influential if they're personalized. It's okay to think about doing some of those things and have very high expectations for the kind of return you're going to get, but that expectation, it's better to start off small, to do a pilot project than to go in gangbusters and think that you're going to get a huge return on some of these things, because we're talking about multiple channels here, and some teams pay attention. The reason that it's important to use a multi-channel approach is that some teams pay attention to one channel, but not the others. Those are just channels that serve as a reminder to them to take action in the channel of preference.
Yes, and to wrap up that point, I think to tied with that, it's hard to have realistic expectations of the influence if you don't establish goals before picking the tools that you're going to use to get there, right? I think if you do a good job of researching the different methods of reaching students particularly, like just in the context of digital channels for a second, we talked about influence of digital advertising to students. If you don't do the right things with respect to understanding what good performance of a campaign is, it's hard to set realistic expectations of what a campaign is. So establishing your goals before picking the tools and before setting those expectations is very important when it comes to identifying and utilizing these new resources.
All right, let's hop into Q&A. We have a bunch of questions around texting, so I'm going to start there. Quick point of reference, Michael, which article did you cite about texting and prospective students a few minutes ago?
It was a post from Inside Higher Ed last week. It appeared on Thursday in the Call to Action blog. So you can just go to Inside Higher Ed and search for Michael Stoner, and you'll find the article.
Gil, I'm going to throw one your way. And I think this is a tough one, but I have a feeling you're going to have a great answer. So in the absence of an unlimited budget, because I don't know that we've, been able to figure out how to grow the money trees in the backyard yet. If anyone has, let me know. I'm really curious. But so in the absence of unlimited resources and an unlimited budget, what digital ad channels do you see as the most effective for targeting prospective students?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I think that we spoke about retargeting a little bit, and I think retargeting is one of those opportunities to do, but only if you have the capacity to do effectively and without over bombarding students with too many ad impressions. And there's controls that you can put in place. I'd love to talk through those on a separate conversation. I can send recording to a webinar I did a few weeks ago on the do's and don'ts of digital marketing for higher education. So feel free to tweet me and I can tweet back a link. And in fact, I'll just do what Mallory does and just tweet out a link shortly with the link to that webinar. But I think that there are a lot of different opportunities for engaging students with digital marketing. I think in general, if you can be as precise with your channels as you can, that's going to help. Just one example would be, Facebook advertising. There's different ways to advertise on Facebook, some more precise, some less precise. The precise, the less precise would be demographic profiling, interest profiling, those sorts of things. And you don't need, if you're doing that as your Facebook advertising, there's definitely opportunities to be a little bit more effective. Something like custom audience targeting would be a very great opportunity for engaging prospective students across not just Facebook, but a lot of different channels. And again, I can walk through that process more in depth, but at a super high level, what you do is you take your lists of prospects. So your inquiry list, your search list that you buy, that you've modeled well, and you identify these are the students we want to reach, load them into some digital marketing software. This is, again, super simplified, but and then advertise to them across those channels. And so that those ads are limited only to the students who you've identified that are found in that pool, versus others that might try to find other students. And you have so much access to the data on students that you're trying to reach through various channels that you don't need to cast wider nets via digital. You need to use the data that you have better. So I think custom audience targeting, for one, would be a very effective way to identify your prospects and serve a clear call to action based on where they are, right? So a search name having a discover us message versus an inquiry having an apply now message, that sort of thing.
Yep. Really great advice. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And Gil, I'll keep this one with you. There was just a question a little while ago when you were talking about the text messaging results. In the research, did we really specify the type of texting from an institution? One of our attendees is kind of pointing out, mass texting is very different from a two-way conversation. And sometimes mass testing is done with kind of the end goal being a two-way conversation, right? But they are two different approaches. And would you say that our results were based on one or the other?
I'm not sure about the distinction there. Michael, do you know how we might have framed that?
I think the question that we asked was whether they had ever received a text from a college.
Mm.
So
all of the above.
Yeah, I think a college, not a college admission, not an admissions officer.
Yeah.
That would be the
right.
one-to-one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we that's right. We do. I don't believe we asked about whether they've ever texted with a college admission officer in specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think generally though, I think if we look at the different channels, when we had that slide that had the different things that they want to receive, those are all things that are going to be in the function of a broadcast message. For the most part, event reminder that's going to go to everybody that registered for the event and opted in to get updates. So I think that says that, if it's contextual, it's not necessarily going to matter whether it comes from the school or from Joe Schmo admissions officer. If a student texts an admissions officer, and this we talk about this at conferences all the time. If a student texts you, it's okay to text them back. Just like if they tweet you, it's okay to tweet them back. But if they don't tweet you directly, or they don't text you directly as a one-on-one person, it may be better to wait and be responsive than to try to creep on their different channels.
Sure. And of course, don't ever creep on their Facebook feed.
unless it's a sponsored advertisement.
They don't want you there.
No. And then our last question that we have today, still about texting. Michael, it sounds as if teens might be more open to texting right then. Perhaps many of us thought they were maybe even just an hour ago. So how can we develop a texting program within an institution, either at the admissions or the central marketing level, that will not turn teens off, right? Because you don't want it to swing the other way.
Well, that's a really important question, and one of the first things I would say is be cautious. So they are more open to texts than I believe they were several years ago. But if you look at that list of things that they said they wanted to be texted about, they're transactional in nature. They're very useful. They're the kinds of reminders that we get from our dentists. If we have a dentist appointment, my dentist texts me to remind me that I have an appointment. That's really useful because it's not always the first thing I'm going to think about. So I think teens value the reminders and pay attention to that kind of thing. What I don't believe they value is the kind of spam texts that Gil was talking about. At one point, it was really easy for people to send out search emails, and so what happened? Lots of really, really ridiculous, honestly, emails that were not particularly useful. That didn't contain calls to action. That was just basically spam, and that's the last thing you want to do with text messages. So if you have a relationship with them, if you've asked for permission, if you can give them something that is valuable and helps them to remember something, or otherwise reminds them of something that they have to do, those kinds of things are really valuable to teens.
Okay. Great. And I would add, as a resource for folks, Mongoose is one of the companies that provides some of these texting services, and they've got a really great blog. And they cover a lot of kind of, everything that you can think of from texting. Prospective students, that's what they're really focused on. So the blog is awesome. I definitely encourage folks to check it out. One final question from Russ just came through the chat. Gil, in relation to casting a wider digital net, are you valuing using existing paid lists versus using something like AdWords for search targeting?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think that comes to the question of what is the goal of your campaign, right? I think if with digital marketing budgets, what they are, I would say that, if you could spend, I would say investing in search engine optimization on your site is potentially, again, depending on the institution, depending on the program, potentially a better use of resources and time than a PPC campaign using specific keywords. And I think those advertisements are not going to necessarily turn a prospect off, but they're going to be labeled ads in search results versus organically trafficked pages. So looking at, and we talked about this in the Mythbusting websites paper last year, looking at your academic program pages, are they optimized for SEO? And if they are, is the content there good for a prospective student to be looking for? Because in a lot of ways, your academic program pages are kind of the back door to your website that students are using now to access your content. So I think search engine optimization over a PPC campaign using AdWords, potentially, again, depending on on your strategy. If you have a specific program that you really have to highly market for, then that might be a different story. But I think you already buy, if you're an undergraduate, and if you're an undergraduate admissions office, which many of the people who are logged into the webinar are, you already buy lists from various sources, whether it be NRCCUA or others, right? So you already have your thousands or hundreds of thousands of names that you've already bought and identified, right? So if you've run those names through a predictive model, which again, you might be paying for, maybe it's built into your platform like Encora Data Lab, you have the opportunity to take that list that you've already identified, already modeled, already are using for legacy communication channels like print and email. Ideally, you would incorporate digital marketing into that pool of students versus trying to go out and find more, because you already have access to those students. Now, a grad student recruitment campaign, you might not have as much access to reliable lists of prospects. So a PPC campaign for a specific program may be a better use of budget. So again, Mallory, your favorite term, goal before tools.
Always.
What is the goal of the campaign? Do's and don'ts of digital marketing webinar. I dropped it in the chat and I tweeted it. There's some great content there. I'm 24/7 on Twitter and the rest of the social medias. Feel free to keep the conversation going.
Can we test that, Gil? What if we tweet you at 2 a.m.?
I emailed my boss at 4 o'clock this morning. Who else was up? Anybody?
Oh, for Eastern, no. Definitely not. And folks, I want to address two questions that came through just really quickly. Craig asked if there's any research on virtual tours and the impact they have on students. And that was actually something that we looked at last year in Mythbusting website. So I've already tweeted and chatted a link to where you can download that content. So that is found in our previous studies, and we don't have that on hand at the moment. So I definitely encourage you to go check that out. And then Brian asked what percentage of the surveyed teens were first-gen students this year, and if their answers differed from the overall results. And Michael, Gil, correct me if I'm wrong, but we break that down in the white paper, right?
We do break that down in the white paper. I don't remember overall, but where we saw big differences, we highlighted those, and did so for some of those questions today.
Have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks again, Gil and Michael. We'll see you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.